Welcome to the DARKSTREAM, Vox Day, voxday.blogspot.com, and unauthorized.tv. Well, I hope you had a happy post-Independence Day. That could be a reference to it being July 5th, or it could be a reference to the fact that the United States of America is no longer independent in any meaningful sense, and certainly Americans are a invaded and occupied people. That sounds depressing. It shouldn't be, because, you know, the first act in attempting to successfully resolve a problem is to identify it. And as long as people remain falsely convinced that America is the most free place in the world and we're bombing people in Syria because the Syrians hate us for our freedom, and we're sending aircraft carriers to go through the South China Sea to defend our freedoms, and we're sending destroyers into the Black Sea and enter Russian territorial waters to defend our freedom. I mean, it's total nonsense. You know it, I know it. Most of the people in the media who are still trying to sell you on it know it. You look at Afghanistan. Think about how much blood, American blood, and innocent foreign blood has been shed there. How many tens of billions of dollars have been wasted there so that the US government could delay the Taliban takeover, for 20 years. Nothing's changed. The Taliban will take control in Afghanistan relatively soon. I think they already control something like 144 out of the 507 or so districts in Afghanistan. Why? Because the occupying power always loses when it stops occupying. This is basic. There's a reason why Rome would either colonize the entire conquered area with Roman colonists and clear everybody else out of there, or they would simply establish a client king and leave it all up to him. If they wanted a client king, they just wanted to take their tribute. They just wanted to take the money. And the problem is that America is not, and never was, an idea. Okay? Think about how many of you accepted the concept of the proposition nation. I did when I was younger. I bought into the whole civic nationalist lie because I never thought about it. Of course, as soon as I started thinking about it, I thought that makes no sense. If you subscribe to the idea that America is nothing but an idea, then America's over. America's dead. Nobody still Nobody in power still subscribes to those ideas. The good news is that America isn't an idea. It never was. America is a nation. It's all of the people who are descended from the people who lived in the 13 colonies, declared independence, and formed their own state, formed their own country. Now, not everybody is a pure 100% descendant of those people. Not all of those people, not all the forefathers were British. Mostly British. Again, this should be entirely obvious because if you notice, the American War for Independence was not fought against the Manchu dynasty. It was not fought against the Pope and the Papal States. It was not fought against the Holy Roman Empire. American independence was not declared from the King of Poland or the King of Sweden. Okay? Now, if you're descended from later immigrants from Germany, from Ireland, from Switzerland, from Italy, from Eastern Europe, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're not a U.S. citizen. But it means you're not an American. You know, and that's fine. I'm not Italian. You know, I lived in Japan. I spoke Japanese. Didn't make me Japanese. The state is not the nation. The paperwork is not the blood. You know, now these things are not entirely black and white. It's a gradient. But the fact that there's a gradient does not mean that black is white, and it doesn't mean that neither black nor white exist. They do. You know, I'm not a pure American, despite the fact that at least two of my ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. Ironically enough, in light of the whole topic about America being British, one of my revolutionary forefathers was an Irish colonel and personal friend of George Washington named George Galloway. Now, I don't know anything about George Galloway. I didn't even know that I was descended from him until the editor at Bleeding Cool, who was attempting to prove that I was some sort of terrible person, dug deeper into my family background than I ever have. And it was kind of funny because, he openly concluded correctly that I'm not a white supremacist. And, just concluded that, well, I just have some very unusual ideas, but my ideas are not unusual. That's what's so crazy about clown world today. What I'm saying was directly reflected in the writings of many of the forefathers, as well as the philosophers who influenced them. And, it was kind of funny. I'd always assumed that we were part Irish because of some stuff that my family member has said, but I'd always thought it was from the maternal side. I didn't realize, I'd always thought that on the paternal side that we were English and German. Turns out no, it was a English-Irish mix. And then of course the whole American Indian thing and so forth. And you know, American Indians were literally barred from being considered even U.S. citizens for a long time. And I think it wasn't until like sometime in the early 20th century that they passed a law saying that they were to be regarded as such. So obviously, American Indians are not American, which is why, of course, we have our own sovereign reservations. That's why I always like to use the rhetoric when people say, "Well, how do you describe yourself?" I always say I'm a red reservationist, because no matter what they say about equality and that sort of thing, not even the most SJW of SJWs wants to be quoted as saying that Indians should not be permitted to have their reservations. So I find that mildly amusing. Anyhow, the point is that Americans have literally nothing to fear from the fall of the U.S. government. Excuse me. Americans have nothing to fear and much to gain from the collapse of the U.S. empire. You know, even Yoram Hazony, who's a fake nationalist, he's basically a gatekeeper who's been pushed forward because of the failure of Ben Shapiro and the intellectual dark web to keep those who rejected the neocons from further embracing nationalism. So now now that civic nationalism has increasingly failed, they are attempting to gatekeep the truth seekers and the nationalists by saying, well, nationalism's kind of okay, but it should include everybody who wants to be there, which is just watered down civic nationalism, of course. But one thing that Hazony did say that was relevant and significant even was that the way that most empires end up being taken over and led by a foreign elite. Now, Hazony is Jewish, and obviously in the case of the US, the foreign elite happens to be Jewish, but he's not talking about that per se. He's making a correct observation, a historical observation. If, for example, you look at China, you'll see that a number of their dynasties, such as the Manchu dynasty, were foreigners. If you look at Rome, it wasn't very long before some of the emperors, and then eventually all the emperors, were non-Romans. And speaking of Rome, that reminds me of something else that I wanted to point out. The mistake one of the mistakes that America's forefathers made, America's founders made, is that they failed to anticipate and protect the ability of the nation to rule the state. Now, the Romans did that, and what they did is they established a patrician class. And the patricians were the descendants of the 100 families who were the original senators. They're not exactly sure how. There's some theories that say, oh, well, the patricians were actually all of the founding families. Others are Others are, think that it was just those descended from the senators, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that you had an established group of people with a original attachment to the state and to the nation, and they had particular powers that were limited to them. And that didn't mean that everybody else was excluded, because you also had the plebeian class. And the plebs were numerous. They were allowed to be senators. They were allowed to join the aristocracy, etc., etc. They became equestrians. They became, they even had special offices that only they could hold. But the important thing is that there was a distinction and there was a limitation on the power that the non-patricians could wield. And this is one of the many reasons, and it might be one of the more important reasons, that the Roman Republic lasted as long as it did. And what I'm addressing here is what, frankly, I regard as a, no offense, but I regard as a utterly stupid and ignorant question. Swolair says, Vox, I'm happy to accept my non-American status. If I'm a Euromut, where do I go? Well, that's what I'm saying. It's not necessary for non-Americans to go anywhere. What it's important for them to do is to understand that they're not Americans. They don't necessarily get it. They can't get it fully. And what they should do is they should trust the people who are actually descended from the founders to rule over them in some capacity. I mean, here's the insane thing, and we've seen it again and again and again and again. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's the Irish coming to the States. It doesn't matter whether it's the Jews going to Palestine. It doesn't matter if it's Californians going to Texas or Colorado. People who enter a new polity often want to change it. So they want to enter the place because they find it preferable to where they were before. And the first thing that they try to do, not all of them, but those among them who are interested in seeking power, attempt to seek power and attempt to change it. And this should not be permitted. The Romans didn't permit it. The Romans had the sense to reserve the power to the patrician class. And it was explicitly for that reason. That's why you couldn't be a censor. The censor was basically their equivalent of the Supreme Court. He could overrule laws and kick senators out and that sort of thing. You had to be a patrician to be a censor. And look at what happened when the inevitable, over time, just the same way that you see people saying, well, I'm just as American as anybody who's descended from an American revolutionary. My grandparents came over from Sweden. Well, and a lot of people would say, well, yeah, I mean, they've been there for 3 generations, 4 generations. They're real Americans now. Only they're not. They have no tradition. None of these immigrants, Germans, Irish, Swedes, Italians, Jews, none of them ever had any tradition of limited government. And for all that they might have professed their love of it and their loyalty to it and that sort of thing, what's the first thing they always started trying to do when elected to power? Change the rules in favor of themselves. That's normal. That's what people do. You know, and unfortunately, just, you know, they like to say, well, the forefathers they knew a lot about the Greeks and the Romans, and so blah blah blah. Well, you know, they really failed on that one. You know, they tried to limit the vote to, you know, men with a certain amount of property. I mean, that was fine. But what they should have done is they should have absolutely limited it to, you know, they should have reserved certain positions like 50%, you know, 51% of the Senate and the majority of of Congress or whatever, and various other offices, including the presidency and certainly the Supreme Court, should have been reserved for people who were descendants of the revolutionaries, the colonists, the people who actually, the posterity of the people who wrote the Constitution. You know, look at what happened to Rome and look at how quickly things fell apart. The first civil war in Rome was not the one that ended the Republic. It was the prelude to it, and the instigator was Gaius Marius. Now, Gaius Marius was a man of great capability. You know, he was probably, in many ways, superior to any of the patricians at the time. He was what they called a new man because he was influential in Rome, despite the fact that he wasn't even Roman. He was Italian. And so, you know, technically, I don't think he even necessarily counted as a, he probably would have been numbered among the plebeians, but he was almost certainly, not a pleb in the original sense because he wasn't a Roman. Nevertheless, he ends up getting elected as consul. And then, guess what he does? Surprise, surprise. He's the first in centuries to illegally hold multiple consulships in a row. You know, and it's excused. It's all excused because of the need to fight off the Germans. You know, never mind the fact that they defeated the Greeks, they defeated Carthage, they defeated pretty much everyone with their system of annual consul changing. You know, so this non-Roman not only does that, but then manages to set himself up as a bloody dictator. He doesn't respect the Roman traditions. Now, a patrician rose up in opposition to him, who was also very capable. This is, of course, Sulla. Sulla beats him, slaughters a bunch of his proponents, etc., etc. But Marius's actions had serious consequences. Why? Well, who can tell me who was one of Gaius Marius's proteges? In fact, he was such a significant protege that there was a widespread belief within Rome that Sulla was going to execute him, despite the fact that he was fairly young. Caesar. Very good. Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar to be precise. And what did Caesar learn from Marius? Well, what he learned was to disregard Roman traditions, despite the fact that he was a patrician. And of course, you all know the story. He marches on Rome, etc., etc. The Civil War starts, and ultimately Octavian wins and declares himself emperor. And if I recall correctly, although Octavian was adopted, I don't think that he was a patrician. I'd have to look it up. Maybe one of you can look it up and figure out whether Augustus Caesar was actually a patrician or not. But either way, the system that had lasted hundreds and hundreds of years didn't survive more than a century of the passage of laws that essentially eradicated the difference between patrician and plebeian. It could just be a correlation. It could just be a coincidence, but I don't believe so. I strongly suspect that the reason that Rome degraded from a republic to an empire was the combination of A, allowing the Italians to become full Roman citizens, and B, the elimination of the distinction between patrician and plebeian in the elite. Yep, I was correct. He was from an equestrian branch of a plebeian family. So he was, equestrian was the knightly class, so he was noble, but he was not a patrician, and under the traditional Roman system would never have been allowed to be in a position to make himself emperor. And so, I think it's like, I'd have to look it up, but I think it was about 134, I think the Republic fell 134 or so years after the elimination of the distinction between patricians and plebeians. There were still, there's still some minor ones, but the essential ones. And it happened over time. At first you had you Gaius Marius, then you had Julius Caesar, then you had Octavian, and so or Octavius. But the point is that newcomers all never ever fully understand either the traditions or the importance of those traditions, which is why it is vital to not permit newcomers to rule over the natives. And yet that's what we see again and again in particularly the late stages of empire. In the late stages of empire, what usually precedes a complete collapse is when the ruler is a total outsider. You look at Ireland, which is now being ruled by first it's being ruled by the EU, but it's also, the president is an Indian. You look at the nominal leadership of the United States right now. You've got a guy who is very proudly Irish, and a vice president who is some strange melange of Indian and African and who knows what else. Being ruled over by foreigners is considered a curse in the Bible. It means you're not doing something right. And so, the the law should reflect the wisdom of the traditions of the past. That doesn't mean that there's no place for political involvement, that there's no place for discussion and consultation and even an amount of guidance. But at the end of the day, the people making the important decisions should be the people who are the descendants of the natives, of the people who founded the state. Because any other way is going to lead to the sort of clown world nonsense. It's either going to lead, it's either going to lead to collapse or clown world. Or ultimately both. But the good news, and I'm not a big fan of either Andrew Anglin or the people who write for him. Some of you may be aware that I once engaged in what was supposed to be some sort of debate with Andrew Anglin, and I think if you read the transcript, you can see that it didn't go well for him. But he wrote, or rather his writers wrote a really good piece today that's on the on-site. And it's a reminder that the USA is a state. It's not the American nation. The American nation currently makes up about 50% or so of the population of the United States, of the citizenship of the United States. If you look at the numbers, 72 million Americans are majority British descent. If you include the obviously some of those people are descended from British people who came over later, but it's a good proxy. It's a reasonable proxy for the those who are descended from the original colonists. If you look at those who are who are majority American. If you look at the those who are just at least descended in part, that's where you get to about 50% of the population. That nation is still going to be there when the US government collapses. So that's why it's important for you to understand what your nation is, because your nation is going to outlive the state called the USA. The Jewish people survived despite not having a state for a long time. The German people survived despite not having a state for a long time. And it's important for you to understand the difference, because then you're not going to be living in fear as you see the empire collapsing. In fact, given the way that Americans are increasingly being attacked and oppressed by the US government, it's something for us to celebrate. And the enemies of America even acknowledge this. They acknowledge this because they hate the flag. The flag doesn't represent the US government. The reason that there's a black national anthem is because they're not Americans. They're US citizens, but they have their own nation, and that's fine. I respect that. More power to them. They understand that you're not part of their nation. Why would you think that you're part of theirs or they're part of yours? Accept and respect their opinion. The more that people see the truth and speak the truth and accept the truth, the more that we can get along honestly together. War doesn't come because I'm from nation A and you're from nation B. It comes when people try to pretend that we're all the same and I have the right to tell you what to do and take your stuff. The Idaho Crusader says, I'm a heritage Idahoan and my state is being overrun by foreigners. The political positions are largely being held by people not born here. Exactly. That's exactly the problem. And it's the fault of people for not passing laws saying, if your great-grandfather, if you don't have at least one great-grandfather who was born here, you can't hold office. So, anyhow, I want you to be encouraged by the fact that your nation is not your state. And your allegiance should be to your nation. That's where your ties of blood are. That's often where your ties of soil are. And those are the connections that survive. There's no such thing as an idea nation. That's like saying, well, he's not a real person. He's an idea person. He's a proposition person. So don't get caught up in the nonsense of clown world. Don't accept the false definitions of clown world. Seek the truth, speak the truth, and embrace the truth. That's all I really had to say on that topic for now. I hope you enjoyed the little Roman digression. ARC Tunes on Wednesday is going to be interesting. After doing all this time of talking about how we're the shorter panel, we're trying to move to shorter panels in general and that sort of thing. We've actually got a Midnight's War episode that's like longer than the original Webtoons episodes. It just tried to, it's where the natural end point of that particular story went. So we decided to roll with it rather than artificially split it up. So if you're not making a habit of reading ARC Tunes, I highly recommend that you do. Thanks very much to those of you who have been renewing your unauthorized subscriptions. I know somebody just mentioned that they just signed up for their 3rd year of annual. Really appreciate that, and I've got some, I think, very good news coming quite soon on the unauthorized front. I was told that tonight they had live streaming working. I decided not to try to put it to the test tonight, as you can tell, but I think that based on the way that they usually progress, once they make that breakthrough, getting it implemented usually isn't too long. So hopefully by this time next week, we will be streaming live on unauthorized as well as on DLive. Not just me, but all the creators. So that's what we are working towards. Also, a nice benefit will be that it will automatically upload it. And so I apologize. I finally got caught up yesterday, so I'm gonna make an effort to at least keep up for the next week or two until I don't have to do the uploads anymore. So that'll be good. And that's all I've got for tonight. So I look forward to seeing you the next time. And in the meantime, this is the Dark Stream. I'm Vox Day.